Hello everyone, this is Peter from Birds of Play, and welcome to 5 Things to Fix. A series where we recommend 5 fixes for games that have been doing just fine without our help. In this video, we will be looking at one of our all-time favorite games, Final Fantasy X. Fix number 1. Cinematography. As a series, Final Fantasy has always had a flair for the cinematic. Be it the heroes on the hill in the original Final Fantasy, the Magitech armor marching on Nash in Final Fantasy VI, or Squall and Cypher going at it like madmen in the opening cinematic of Final Fantasy VIII. Final Fantasy X can, however, claim to be the first truly cinematic game in the Final Fantasy series. As has been established, previous installments had, of course, featured cinematic moments, even prompting Squaresoft to justify trying to make a feature-length film based on the franchise. Final Fantasy X itself featuring lavish, fully rendered cutscenes. Final Fantasy X was, nevertheless, the first game in the series to feature fully 3D in-game cutscenes, the 3D environments enabling the camera to move around freely, framing a fully voiced cast for the first time in Final Fantasy history. Previous installments had mostly relied on pre-rendered backgrounds, making it impossible to change the angle without resorting to a pre-rendered cinematic. This often made the drama feel more theatrical as opposed to genuinely cinematic in the modern sense. The camera work, however, often leaves a lot to be desired, as the camera floats around, seemingly with a mind of its own, almost as if the camera was a secret 8th member of the party. For the most part, the camera work is perfectly serviceable, especially for a game from this time period. However, coupled with an overuse of motion blur, a nauseating shaky cam, and the occasionally awkward camera angle, it has an air of amateurism about it. Even though it can be charming, reminding us that the games are made by people, it ultimately affects the quality of the game negatively. This is a hard thing to fix, seeing as it would entail drastically reinventing the cinematography of the game. However, establishing a healthy relationship with motion blur might be a good place to start. Fix number 2. Unskippable Cutscenes. Speaking of problematic cutscenes, Final Fantasy X is notorious for the cutscenes being unskippable. Not only are they unskippable, but sometimes they take place right before a challenging boss fight, meaning that if you lose the fight, you will be forced to watch the entire cutscene again. As someone who doesn't generally skip cutscenes, this wasn't really much of an issue the first few times around. Even though I admit having to re-watch cutscenes after a humiliating defeat did little to add to the experience. The best you can do is mash buttons to shorten some of the dialogue. But even then, it won't help much if there's still an animation that has to play out. It seems like the developers were still wrapping their head around these new cinematic in-game cutscenes, finally making good on the mistake 2 years later in Final Fantasy X-2 by letting players skip them. Skipping cutscenes in Final Fantasy X-2, however, affected the completion percentage, that in turn affected the game's ending, withholding the best ending from players that skip cutscenes as a punishment. Concerning Final Fantasy X, the fix is simple. Let players skip cutscenes, no strings attached. Set us free, and if we love you, we will stay. I love you. Fix number 3. Switching party members. Unlike previous installments that allowed you to play as a party of 4 or 3, in Final Fantasy X, the entire party's along for the ride, excluding some parts where they get separated temporarily. This means that once all the characters have assembled, you can have a total of 7 party members to choose from for any given fight, although only 3 of them can be in play at any given time, the rest getting swapped in at the player's convenience. This in itself makes for an interesting dynamic, encouraging you to make use of the different characters' strengths depending on the situation. You can also make use of this mechanic to switch out wounded allies for some fresh meat, effectively healing your lineup, even though the others will still be suffering in silence on the bench. The part where this interesting system becomes a detriment to the game is in the allocation of experience points after each battle, only affording experience points to party members that actually participated in the battle. On the surface, this seems fair enough, only rewarding those party members that are pulling their weight. In practice, however, This forces players to constantly switch out party members if they want to level everybody up. This means letting everyone getting their turn, even if you could finish the battle faster without their help. This drags battles out and makes the already tedious task of grinding even more tedious. With endgame grinding in Final Fantasy X already being quite tiresome, this adds insult to injury. The fix is quite simple: letting everybody get experience points even though they didn't participate. Fix number 4. Limited New Game Plus. Seeing as Final Fantasy X's endgame can be particularly long and winding, with monsters to hunt, celestial weapons to collect, and chocobos to ride, to name a few, it's a shame your hard work is doomed to obsolescence with each subsequent playthrough, making you start all over again without anything to show for it. Except that you can reload old save games to upload Albed primers you have collected, allowing you to understand the cryptic language of the Albed. Just like with skippable cutscenes, the developers rectified this in the sequel, introducing a robust New Game Plus, allowing the player to carry over the progress after finishing the game. I'm not saying that every game needs or should have a New Game Plus mode, but what bothers me is that Final Fantasy X only had a hint of one, in the form of transferring Albed primers across save games. This is necessary to understand what the Albed are saying early on in the game, which is impossible for first-time players, effectively encouraging players to replay the game. If you're telling players they need to play your game more than one time to unlock all its secrets, at least let them keep some of the hard work. Implementing a more substantial New Game Plus, instead of just toying with the idea, would address the problem, as well as increasing the replayability of the game. Fix number 5. Tidus. The last fix is Tidus himself, or more accurately, just one thing about him. No, it's not his laugh or his questionable fashion choices. Not even the isolated incident of kleptomania aboard the SS Leaky, where he assaults a fellow passenger and takes his camera. No, it's actually his name. Not that there's anything wrong with Tidus, but that's kind of the point. In older games, you could name every character, making use of all the dialogue being text-based. This, however, becomes a bit awkward in a fully voiced game like Final Fantasy X, especially considering that Tidus is in all other aspects a fully fleshed out character, making it difficult to justify the option to name him as a form of roleplay. Subsequent Final Fantasy games made away with this trend for good reason. One of the problems is that allowing the player to name the character makes it impossible for the other characters to say his name. In Final Fantasy X-2, Yuna always says something like you or him, as opposed to saying his name, which sounds rather unnatural considering that they don't hesitate in naming the other characters. The option to name Tidus also results in players being unsure how to pronounce his name, either pronouncing it Tidus or Titus. I can appreciate the thought behind allowing us to name the character, but in practice, it's a mechanic that has outlived its usefulness in fully voiced games with a fleshed out character. Thank you for watching 5 fixes for Final Fantasy X. If you liked the video, make sure to subscribe. Also, join in the conversation and let us know some of your fixes down in the comments below. Until next time, that's something a bird would say, right? Do birds say that?